The morning Eleanor Shane learned she'd been sold to clear a gambling debt, she was darning stockings by the kitchen window. Her father couldn't meet her eyes as he spoke, his weathered hands trembling against the pine table. $3,000, he said. Thomas Hartley owns everything the farm, the livestock, even next season's seed. Eleanor's needle stilled. Through the cracked glass, she watched dust devils dance across their barren fields, mocking the dreams they'd brought to Texas. There's another way, her father continued, voice breaking. He's willing to forgive it all if you'll marry him. Her mother wept silently. From the loft above, Eleanor heard her younger siblings shift on their straw mattresses, listening. When? Eleanor asked, surprised by her steady voice. Saturday. 3 days. She set down the stocking, her childhood ending with that simple gesture. Then I'll need my Sunday dress cleaned. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The wagon ride to Widowmaker Ranch stretched 3 hours through limestone hills that rose like ancient bones from the Texas earth. Eleanor sat rigid beside Miguel, Thomas Hartley's foreman, her single carpet bag wedged between her feet. The man had said nothing since collecting her that morning, but his silence felt different from her father's shame. It carried an unexpected gentleness. Señorita, Miguel finally spoke as they crested a hill. Mr. Hartley, he is not what people say. Before Eleanor could respond, the ranch spread before them like a small kingdom. 50,000 acres of prime grazing land rolled toward the horizon, bisected by a creek that glinted silver in the afternoon sun. The main house rose from a grove of live oaks, its white limestone walls gleaming like polished bone. She'd heard talk of Hartley's wealth, but seeing it stole her breath. They passed under an iron archway with Widowmaker Ranch branded across it, a name that should have frightened her more than it did. Cowboys working near the road stopped to watch their passage. Eleanor braced for crude stares or worse, but each man simply touched his hat brim respectfully before returning to work. They know better, Miguel said quietly, noting her surprise. Mr. Hartley doesn't tolerate disrespect toward women. The wagon pulled up to the main house where a plump Mexican woman waited on the wide porch, her gray hair pinned beneath a spotless white kerchief. She descended the steps with surprising grace. Ah, mija, Mrs. Ochoa said, taking Eleanor's hands. The warmth in her voice made Eleanor's eyes sting. Come, you must be tired. Miguel, bring the señorita's things. Eleanor followed the housekeeper through rooms that spoke of wealth but not ostentation, heavy oak furniture, Navajo rugs, paintings of cattle and sunset vistas. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed a library lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. Mr. Hartley is in his study, Mrs. Ochoa said, leading her upstairs. He asks that you rest first. The ceremony is at 6. As Eleanor entered the guest room, her room now, she supposed movement at a window across the courtyard caught her eye. A tall figure stood watching, silhouetted against lamplight. Thomas Hartley. Even from this distance, she could feel the weight of his gaze. Then he stepped back, disappearing into shadow, leaving Eleanor to wonder what kind of man bought a wife but granted her the courtesy of distance. Mrs. Ochoa appeared at the guest room door at 5 o'clock, her arms laden with white fabric that caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. Eleanor sat up from where she'd been staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her life had turned so completely in 3 days. Mija, I have something for you. The housekeeper's weathered face held such kindness that Eleanor's throat tightened. Mrs. Ochoa laid the dress across the bed, her mother's wedding dress, somehow retrieved from the Shane farm and cleaned until it gleamed like new snow. The Irish lace at the collar had been mended with tiny, perfect stitches. Even the pearl buttons, which Eleanor remembered her mother polishing with a soft cloth on quiet evenings, shone with careful attention. How did you? Eleanor began, but Mrs. Ochoa pressed a finger to her lips. Mr. Hartley, he thinks of everything. He said a bride should have something of her mother's on such a day. The older woman helped Eleanor dress, her gentle hands smoothing the fabric, adjusting the cameo brooch at her throat. Another surprise. Her grandmother's brooch that should have been sold months ago to buy seed. The small chapel sat behind the main house, built of the same white limestone, with a simple wooden cross atop its peaked roof. Inside, beeswax candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn pews. Only 4 people waited: Thomas Hartley in a plain black suit, Judge Morrison with his kind eyes and silver beard, Miguel standing as witness, and Mrs. Ochoa, who squeezed Eleanor's hand before taking her seat. Thomas looked different in the candlelight, younger somehow, despite the silver threading through his dark hair. When Eleanor entered, his gray eyes found hers and held them with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She'd expected coldness, perhaps even cruelty. Instead, she found something she couldn't quite name, a sadness maybe, or a loneliness that matched her own. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his voice gentle as old leather. Dearly beloved, we gather here in the sight of God to join this man and woman in holy matrimony. The familiar words felt strange in this context, more like a business contract than a sacrament. Yet when Thomas took her hand, his touch was surprisingly warm, his calluses speaking of a man who worked his own land despite his wealth. Thomas Hartley, the judge continued, do you take Eleanor Shane to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, from this day forward? Thomas's voice came low and steady, meant only for Eleanor's ears. I do, and I promise to honor your freedom as I honor your person, to respect your choices as I respect your dignity. The addition to the traditional vows made Eleanor's breath catch. These weren't the words of a man claiming property. When her turn came, Eleanor's voice barely rose above a whisper, but it didn't waver. I do. Judge Morrison pronounced them married, but Thomas made no move to kiss his bride. Instead, he bowed slightly, as formal as if they'd been introduced at a church social. Mrs. Hartley, he said quietly, and somehow the title on his lips sounded like a question rather than a declaration. The wedding dinner took place in the smaller dining room, the one with windows facing the sunset. Mrs. Ochoa had prepared simple fare roasted chicken, fresh bread, early vegetables from the kitchen garden. The blue willow china seemed too fine for such a modest meal. But no one commented on the contradiction. They ate mostly in silence, the clink of silver against porcelain the loudest sound in the room. The spring calving went well, Miguel offered at one point, clearly trying to ease the tension. 80% success rate. Thomas nodded, cutting his meat with precise movements. The new bull from San Antonio proved worth the cost then. Eleanor watched these men discuss ranch business as if this were any ordinary dinner, as if a girl hadn't just been sold to settle a gambling debt, as if the whole county wouldn't be talking about this marriage by tomorrow. She pushed food around her plate, her stomach too knotted to eat despite Mrs. Ochoa's obvious skill. As darkness gathered outside the windows, Thomas set down his napkin and stood. If you'll excuse me, he said, addressing Eleanor directly for the first time since the ceremony. I have correspondence that requires attention. Mrs. Ochoa will help you with anything you need. He paused at the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might say something more, offer some explanation for this strange, hollow wedding. Instead, he simply nodded and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. Eleanor sat in the dining room as the candles burned lower, wondering what kind of man married a woman only to abandon her on their wedding night, what kind of game Thomas Hartley was playing, and why his absence felt more like mercy than insult. Through the window, she could see a light burning in his study, and the shadow of a man bent over his desk, as alone as she was. Mrs. Ochoa touched her shoulder gently. Come, mija. Let me show you to your room. The master bedroom waited like a question Eleanor wasn't ready to answer. The four-poster bed loomed in the lamplight, its quilts turned down in matrimonial invitation. Eleanor stood in the doorway, still wearing her mother's dress, understanding finally that whatever happened next would happen on Thomas Hartley's terms. She had no idea those terms would offer her something she'd never dared hope for, the chance to choose her own fate. Eleanor sat on the edge of the four-poster bed, her mother's wedding dress replaced by her grandmother's white cotton nightgown that Mrs. Ochoa had somehow also retrieved from the Shane farm. The fabric felt too thin, too revealing for this moment of waiting. The hurricane lamp on the bureau cast wavering shadows across the dark wood furniture and the Persian rug that must have cost more than her father's entire farm. She had been sitting there for an hour, maybe two, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway mark time with its steady rhythm. The house had grown quiet. Mrs. Ochoa retired to her quarters. Miguel gone to the bunkhouse. Even the ranch dog settled for the night. Only the occasional creak of timber adjusting to the cooling night air broke the silence. A soft knock made her jump. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders. "Come in." Thomas entered, still fully dressed in his black suit, though he'd removed the jacket and rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbows. In his hands, he carried a small pine box, no bigger than a cigar case, with brass hinges that caught the lamplight. He set it carefully on the bureau, then stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. "Your wedding gift, Mrs. Hartley." His voice held an odd formality, as if they were strangers meeting in a bank rather than husband and wife alone in a bedroom. "I thought, that is, I believed you should have this tonight." Eleanor rose slowly, the quilt still wrapped around her like armor. "Mr. Hartley, I don't understand. The ceremony, this room. Now a gift. What is it you want from me?" "Nothing." The word came quick and firm. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. Open the box." Her hands trembled as she lifted the simple brass latch. Inside, instead of the jewelry or trinkets she'd expected, lay a stack of legal documents on cream-colored paper, heavy with official seals and ribbons. She lifted the first page, holding it closer to the lamp to read the elaborate script. "Land deed," Thomas said quietly. 10,000 acres in your name alone. The southern portion of the ranch, including Willow Creek and the Limestone Springs. It's good land, Eleanor. Profitable land." She set down the first document with numb fingers and picked up the second. "This is a bank account. In your name, $5,000. Enough to start over anywhere you choose." He moved to the window, giving her space to process what she was seeing. "There's also a letter of credit that any bank from here to San Francisco will honor, and a legal document stating that you're free to leave this marriage at any time with all these assets intact." Eleanor's legs wouldn't hold her. She sank onto the bed, the papers rustling in her shaking hands. "I don't... Why would you do this?" Thomas turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw emotion crack his controlled facade. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped, to have your choices taken away." He ran a hand through his dark hair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Your father owed money to several men, Mrs. Hartley. When word got out that he was offering his daughter to clear the debt, there were others interested, men who wouldn't have given you a second thought, much less your freedom. So you bought me too. Free me? I bought your father's debt to keep those men away from you. The marriage." He gestured helplessly. "It was the only way to ensure they'd leave you alone. A married woman has protection, an unmarried one doesn't, especially out here." Eleanor studied his face in the lamplight, searching for deception, for some trap she couldn't see. "But you don't know me. Why would you care what happens to a stranger?" Thomas moved to the bureau, his fingers tracing the edge of the pine box. 5 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Margaret. She was from back east, delicate, refined. Her father had arranged our marriage to settle his business debts with my family." His voice grew rough. "She took ill with cholera 3 weeks before our wedding. I rode to San Antonio for medicine, but the roads were washed out from spring storms. By the time I returned..." He didn't finish, but Eleanor understood. The guilt in his voice, the way his shoulders curved inward, this was a man who'd been carrying blame for years, After that, I swore I'd never be part of another forced arrangement. Then I heard about your situation at the cattlemen's meeting last month. Your father was drunk, boasting about how he'd solve his problems by marrying off his beautiful daughter. Thomas's jaw tightened. The way those men looked at each other, already calculating your worth, I couldn't let it happen again. Eleanor picked up the last document from the box, a single sheet of paper covered in Thomas's careful handwriting. That's a letter explaining everything, he said. In case you need proof that this marriage exists in name only, that I've made no claims on you and never will. He moved toward the door. I'll sleep in my study, as I have been. The master bedroom is yours. Tomorrow, if you choose to leave, Miguel will drive you anywhere you wish to go. If you choose to stay... If I stay... The question came out as barely a whisper. Then you stay as my partner, not my property. You'll learn the ranch business if you're interested. You'll have your own money, make your own decisions. And if, someday, you meet someone you wish to marry for love, I'll grant you a divorce with no contest and no scandal. Eleanor stood, still clutching the papers. Mr. Hartley Thomas, this is too much. These documents, this land, it must be worth... It's worth exactly what your freedom is worth, he interrupted. No more, no less. He paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. I know this is overwhelming. Take your time. Think about what you want. For the first time in your life. Eleanor, you get to choose. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with her shock and a box full of possibilities. She spread the documents across the bed, reading them again by lamplight, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what Thomas Hartley had just given her. Not just land or money, but something far more precious, the power to determine her own fate. She moved to the window and looked out across the moon-silvered landscape. 10,000 acres of her own, a bank account that would make her wealthy by any standard, and a husband who slept in his study to preserve her dignity. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching Thomas's shadow move across the lit window of his study below. Who was this man who'd paid a fortune to protect a stranger's daughter, who spoke of honor and freedom as if they mattered more than the conventions that governed their world? She thought of her mother's wedding night, probably spent in tears and resignation, her grandmother's, likely the same. A long line of women who'd had no choices, only duties. And here she stood, holding papers that made her one of the wealthiest women in Texas, given by a husband who asked nothing in return. The lamp flickered, casting new shadows across the room. Eleanor gathered the documents carefully, returning them to the pine box. Tomorrow she would have to decide leave with her newfound wealth or stay with this unusual man who'd turned a devil's bargain into an unexpected gift. But tonight, for the first time since her father had announced her fate, Eleanor Shane Hartley felt something she'd thought lost forever: hope. She climbed into the big bed, pulling the quilts up to her chin, through the floor. She could hear the faint scratch of a pen from Thomas's study below. He was probably working on those business papers he'd mentioned, or perhaps writing in the journal she'd noticed on his desk. Either way, he was keeping his word, maintaining his distance, protecting her even from himself. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thought was not of the fortune in the pine box or the vast acres now bearing her name. It was of gray eyes filled with sadness and understanding, and a voice saying quietly, "You get to choose." For a girl who'd been sold to clear a debt, it was the most valuable gift anyone could have given. And Thomas Hartley, the mysterious rancher everyone feared, had given it freely. The moon traced its path across the Texas sky, and in the master bedroom of Widowmaker Ranch, Eleanor slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, her future finally her own. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Eleanor had made her choice to stay, though she hadn't formally announced it to Thomas. They'd fallen into a careful routine breakfast together in comfortable silence, Thomas explaining ranch operations over coffee. Eleanor spending her days learning from Mrs. Ochoa, or exploring her 10,000 acres on a gentle mare Miguel had assigned her. Evenings, Thomas retreated to his study while Eleanor read in the library. the house big enough for two people to live parallel lives without collision. This morning marked her first trip to town as Mrs. Thomas Hartley. She wore her own simple calico dress, refusing Mrs. Ochoa's suggestion of the fine silks Thomas had apparently ordered from San Antonio. If the townspeople expected to see a pampered bride dripping in jewels, they would be disappointed. Miguel drove the wagon, his presence a quiet comfort as they rolled down Main Street. Eleanor could feel the eyes following them, faces appearing in shop windows, conversations halting mid-sentence. She kept her chin high, her mother's teachings about dignity in the face of adversity serving her well. The general store smelled of pickled brine, coffee beans, and fresh sawdust. Mr. Chen, the Chinese proprietor, greeted her with a deep bow. "Mrs. Hartley, honored to serve you today." Eleanor had prepared a modest list: flour, sugar, coffee, some calico for new curtains in the kitchen. She was examining bolts of fabric when she heard the voices behind her, deliberately pitched to carry. "Well, if it isn't the new Mrs. Hartley." Mrs. Garrett, the banker's wife, stood with two other women from the Ladies' Aid Society, their expressions sharp as the scissors on Mr. Chen's counter. "We were just discussing your unusual circumstances." Eleanor continued examining the fabric, running her fingers along the smooth cotton. "Good morning, Mrs. Garrett. Quite a change from the Shane farm, I imagine. From pauper to princess in one night." Mrs. Garrett's laugh had edges like broken glass. "Your father must be so proud of his bargaining skills." Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "Is there something specific you need, Mrs. Garrett? Mr. Chen is quite busy, and I wouldn't want to monopolize his time." "Oh, we're in no hurry." Mrs. Garrett moved closer, her lavender water perfume cloying in the closed space. "We have all day to discuss how some girls elevate themselves. Though I suppose when one is bought and paid for, elevation is relative." Eleanor's hands stilled on the fabric. Around them, other customers had stopped pretending to shop, openly listening now. Mr. Chen looked distressed, wringing his hands behind the counter. "Tell me," Mrs. Garrett continued, her voice honeyed poison, "does Thomas display you at the ranch like his other purchases? His cattle and horses must enjoy the comparison." "Mrs. Hartley." Thomas's voice cut through the store like a blade through silk. He stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space in a way that made the store suddenly feel smaller. He crossed to Eleanor in 3 strides, his hand settling naturally at the small of her back, not possessive, but protective. "Thomas," Eleanor said quietly, surprised by how steady her voice remained. He looked down at her, and something in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "Forgive my interruption. I finished my business at the bank early and thought you might appreciate assistance with the supplies." He turned to Mrs. Garrett, his expression pleasant, but his eyes cold as winter stone. "Mrs. Garrett, how pleasant to see you. How is your husband's investment in that mining operation working out?" Mrs. Garrett's face flushed. Everyone knew the mine had failed, costing the bank significant losses. "I'm sure I don't involve myself in my husband's business affairs." "No. How interesting." Thomas picked up the bolt of blue calico Eleanor had been examining. "What do you think of this pattern?" "Eleanor, it would complement the morning room beautifully." The use of her first name was deliberate, intimate. Eleanor understood the game now. "I was thinking the same thing. Though I also liked the green." "Get both," Thomas said easily. "In fact, Mr. Chen, we'll take 10 yards of each. My wife has excellent taste, and I trust her judgment completely." He emphasized the word trust, looking directly at Mrs. Garrett. "It's one of the many reasons I married her." "How modern of you," Mrs. B. Garrett managed. "Modern?" Thomas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "There's nothing modern about recognizing quality when you see it. Eleanor brings more value to our ranch than all the cattle in Texas." He paused, letting the words settle. "Of course, not everyone can recognize true worth. Some people mistake price for value, which is why they make such poor investments." The insult landed perfectly. Mrs. Garrett's husband had famously overpaid for several properties that Thomas had passed on, properties now worth half what the bank had loaned against them. Mr. Chen, Thomas continued conversationally, I understand you've received that shipment of books from San Francisco. Eleanor is particularly interested in the agricultural texts. She's been studying our water management systems and has some innovative ideas about irrigation. Eleanor caught on quickly. The creek diversion we discussed at breakfast could increase the eastern pasture yields by 30%. Thomas nodded approvingly. Precisely what I calculated. You see, Mrs. Garrett, I didn't just gain a wife. I gained a partner who understands land management better than most men who've been ranching for decades. His voice carried easily through the store. Any man who'd sell such a woman for mere money is a fool. Fortunately, his loss is my considerable gain. He turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening in a way that looked entirely genuine. Have you selected everything you need? Yes, I believe so. Good. Mr. Chen, please add anything else Mrs. Hartley desires to our account. And that bolt of red silk in the window, send that as well. The color would suit her beautifully. He looked down at Eleanor with something that appeared very much like affection, though she needs no ornament to enhance her natural grace. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but not from embarrassment this time. The way Thomas was looking at her, as if she truly were precious to him, it was almost convincing enough to believe. We should go, she said softly. Mrs. Ochoa will be wondering about lunch. Of course. Thomas offered his arm, and Eleanor took it, feeling the solid strength beneath his jacket. Ladies, he nodded to Mrs. Garrett and her companions, who seemed to have lost their voices entirely. As they walked toward the door, Mr. Chen called out, Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Hartley. He hurried over, his face creased in an unusual smile. Thank you, he said quietly, meant only for their ears. Mrs. Garrett. She makes trouble for many people. Is good someone speaks truth to her. Outside, Thomas helped Eleanor into the wagon where Miguel waited, trying to hide a grin. They rode in silence for several minutes, the town falling away behind them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Thomas stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. I won't have anyone disrespecting you. Not while you're under my protection. I'm not actually your wife. Thomas, not really. He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression made her heart skip. You're more my wife than Margaret ever would have been. You chose to stay. That matters. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Eleanor was acutely aware of Thomas beside her, the warmth of his presence, the way he'd defended her without questioning whether she deserved it. She thought of his words in the store, I gained a partner, and wondered if perhaps he meant them. As the ranch came into view, Thomas cleared his throat. Eleanor, about what I said in there. You were protecting my reputation, I understand. No, I mean... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. The part about your ideas for the ranch, your understanding of the land, that was true. You've learned more in 3 weeks than most would in a year. You have a gift for it. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. You really think so? I know so. That suggestion about the creek diversion, I'd been puzzling over that problem for months. He gave her a sidelong glance. Perhaps tomorrow you'd ride out with me to survey the eastern boundary. I'd value your opinion on some expansion plans. I'd like that, Eleanor said, and meant it. As Miguel pulled the wagon up to the house, Mrs. Ochoa emerged, her face bright with curiosity. Thomas helped Eleanor down, his hands lingering just a moment on her waist. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly. For everything today? Thomas nodded, then seemed to make a decision. Eleanor, you're not under my protection. You're under our protection. This ranch, this life, we're building it together, whether you realize it yet or not. He walked away before she could respond, but his words echoed in her mind throughout the afternoon. That evening, instead of retreating to his study after dinner, Thomas suggested they review the ranch accounts together. They spent 2 hours in the library, heads bent over ledgers, discussing cattle prices and water rights as if they truly were partners. When Eleanor finally retired to her room, she still couldn't think of it as their room. She found the red silk draped across her bed with a note in Thomas's careful handwriting. You deserve beautiful things. Not because you're my wife, but because you're you. T. For the first time since arriving at Widowmaker Ranch, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder if perhaps this marriage might become something neither of them had expected, something real. The evening had started like any other, with Thomas explaining the intricacies of cattle contracts over dinner. Eleanor found herself leaning forward, genuinely fascinated as he detailed how water rights worked in Texas, how a man could own land but not the water running through it, how wars had been fought over creek access. The Hendersons to our north have been trying to buy our water rights for years, Thomas said, pointing to a map spread between their plates. They offer more each season, but that water is what makes the eastern pastures viable. Why not offer them a limited lease, Eleanor suggested, tracing the creek with her finger. They get water during the dry months. We maintain ownership and collect income. Thomas sat back, his eyes brightening with interest. That's actually brilliant. It would ease tensions while maintaining our position. He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. After dinner, Thomas retreated to his study as usual, but Eleanor felt too restless for reading. She wandered the big house, eventually drawn to Thomas's study by the warm light spilling beneath the door. She knocked softly. Come in. She found him at his desk, surrounded by papers, his jacket discarded and sleeves rolled up. The study smelled of leather, tobacco, and ink uniquely masculine and oddly comforting. I'm sorry to disturb you. I was looking for something to read and wondered if you had any books on ranch management. Thomas gestured to the shelves lining the walls. Help yourself. The agricultural texts are on the right, third shelf. As Eleanor browsed the titles, a bundle of letters on a side table caught her eye. The top one bore official seals, and she could see the words Widows Relief Fund clearly written. Oh, I apologize, she said quickly, stepping away. I didn't mean to pry. Thomas looked up from his work, following her gaze. His expression grew uncomfortable. It's nothing. Just some correspondence. But Eleanor had already recognized the names on other visible letters, Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died in a barn fire last year, the widow Martinez with 5 children, old Mrs. Kelly who'd lost her son to pneumonia, all women struggling to keep their small farms afloat. You're helping them, Eleanor said softly. It wasn't a question. Thomas shifted in his chair, clearly uneasy with the discovery. They need assistance. I have more than I need. Eleanor picked up one letter, scanning it quickly. Thomas was paying for the Martinez children's schooling, had bought seed for Mrs. Patterson's spring planting, was covering Mrs. Kelly's mortgage payments. How long have you been doing this? Does it matter? Thomas stood, moving to pour himself brandy from the crystal decanter. His hands weren't quite steady. People suffer enough without losing their homes, too. But you do it secretly. Why not take credit? He gave a bitter laugh. The great Thomas Hartley, buying widows' gratitude that would go over well in town. They already think I'm collecting people like cattle. Eleanor moved closer, studying his profile in the lamplight. Is that what they think you did with me? Collected me? Didn't I? The self-loathing in his voice made her heart ache. No. She said it firmly enough that he turned to face her. You saved me, Thomas. There's a difference. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the approaching storm. Margaret hated storms, he said unexpectedly. She would hide in the root cellar, shaking like a leaf. I used to tease her about it. Eleanor remained quiet, sensing he needed to speak. The night she died, there was a terrible storm. She was alone. I was still trying to get back from San Antonio with the medicine. Her mother said she died calling for me. terrified of the thunder. His voice cracked. I couldn't even comfort her at the end. Thomas, I have money. Eleanor, more than any man needs. But it couldn't buy Margaret's life. Couldn't buy my way back through those floods in time. So now I use it the only way that makes sense, trying to prevent other tragedies. He gestured at the letters. It doesn't absolve me. Nothing will. But perhaps it helps balance the scales slightly. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and rain began pelting the windows. Thomas stood transfixed, lost in memories Eleanor could only imagine. She made a decision. Come with me. What? You've been hiding in this study for 5 years. Thomas, come watch the storm with me. She led him to the front porch, where the rain had created a silver curtain beyond the overhang. The air smelled of wet earth and mesquite. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant moments. Margaret was right to fear them, Eleanor said, settling onto the porch swing. Storms can be terrible, but they're also necessary. They bring water, wash things clean, make things grow. Thomas remained standing, his hands gripping the porch rail. I've been alone so long. Eleanor, I built these walls around myself, and now I don't know how to tear them down. You don't have to tear them down, Eleanor said gently. Just maybe. Open a door now and then. Lightning flashed again, showing his face clearly vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. I'm trying, with you. I'm trying, but I'm not sure I remember how to be with someone. How to be human. Eleanor stood, moving to stand beside him. The rain had soaked his shirt where he leaned past the roof's protection, and she could see him shivering. Without thinking, she went inside and returned with the mohair blanket from his study and the coffee pot Mrs. Ochoa always kept warm on the stove. Here, she said, draping the blanket around his shoulders and pouring coffee into 2 cups she'd brought. Thomas looked at her with such surprise that she almost laughed. When was the last time someone took care of you? Thomas Hartley. I don't remember. They stood together watching the storm, sharing the blanket's warmth. Eleanor could feel the tension slowly leaving Thomas's body, his breathing becoming steadier. I need to tell you something, he said eventually. About your father's debt. Eleanor tensed, but Thomas continued quickly. There were 3 other men interested when word got out. One runs a saloon in San Antonio. He wanted a hostess. Another has a ranch near the border. His last 2 wives died under mysterious circumstances. The third, Thomas's jaw clenched. The third collects beautiful things. He has a reputation for breaking them, and you outbid them all. I didn't have to bid. I held your father's original marker, but yes, I would have paid any price to keep you from those men. He turned to look at her directly. Not because I wanted to own you, Eleanor. Because no one deserves that fate, but especially not someone with your spirit, your intelligence, your light. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. That first night when you gave me the papers, the freedom to leave, I nearly ran. Why didn't you? Because a man who would give me freedom was worth staying to understand. She pulled the blanket tighter around them both. I'm beginning to understand you. Thomas. You're not the cold rancher everyone fears. You're a man who's been hurt, who protects others because no one protected the one person you loved. Loved, Thomas repeated quietly. Past tense. I thought I'd never. That is, I believed that part of me died with Margaret. And now? He looked at her for a long moment, rain misting his face. Now I'm discovering that perhaps hearts can heal, just like land after a drought, with the right conditions, the right person. The storm was passing, thunder growing distant. Eleanor reached for his hand under the blanket, finding it cold and warming it between both of hers. I found your journal, she admitted. Not on purpose, it was on the shelf with the agricultural texts. I'm sorry, but I read some of it. Thomas stiffened but didn't pull away. Then you know. I know you've been writing about me, about how you admire my courage, how you wish you could be the man I deserve. Thomas, she squeezed his hand. You already are that man. You just can't see it yet. Eleanor. His voice was rough with emotion. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. I made my choice that first morning when I didn't pack that carpet bag and leave. I choose to stay. I choose this ranch. This life. She took a breath. I choose you, Thomas, if you'll let me. Thomas turned their joined hands over, studying them as if they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. I'm damaged, Eleanor. The guilt, the loneliness, it's carved pieces out of me. Then we'll fill them in with new memories, better ones. Eleanor moved closer, feeling his warmth through the wet shirt. You gave me freedom, Thomas. Let me use it to choose loving you. The word love hung between them like the last rumble of thunder. Thomas's hand tightened on hers, and when he looked at her, his gray eyes held wonder mixed with fear. I don't know if I remember how to love someone properly. Then we'll learn together. Eleanor reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his jaw. We have time. Thomas leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. When he opened them, something had shifted. The wall he'd built so carefully showed its first real crack. Stay with me, he said softly. Not in the house, not on the ranch. With me. Let me try to be the husband you deserve. Eleanor's answer was to rise on her toes and press her lips softly to his cheek, tasting rain and salt. You already are, Thomas. You already are. They remained on the porch until the storm passed completely, watching stars emerge between scattered clouds. When they finally went inside, Thomas walked Eleanor to the master bedroom door as he had every night, but this time he lingered. Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Thomas. Neither moved. Then Thomas lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Tomorrow, he said, and the word sounded like a promise. Eleanor nodded, understanding. They had tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. Time to heal, time to grow, time to turn a marriage of rescue into one of love. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor could hear Thomas in his study below, but the sounds were different. Instead of the frantic scratching of pen on paper, she heard drawers opening, papers being filed away. He was putting his guilt and correspondence aside, making room for something new. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. Through her window, Eleanor could see puddles reflecting moonlight, the land drinking deep after drought. She thought of Thomas's words about hearts healing like land, and smiled. They were both learning to bloom again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grassland as Eleanor rode beside Miguel, checking the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of her 10,000 acres. They'd been riding for an hour, the older man pointing out landmarks and water sources, sharing the history of the land with quiet patience. Mr. Hartley bought this section 15 years ago, Miguel said, gesturing toward a grove of cottonwoods. Previous owner went broke after the drought of '69. Mr. Thomas. He was just 19 then, but he saw what others didn't, the underground spring there. It never runs dry. Eleanor studied the land with new appreciation. He was young to have such vision. His father raised him to see potential where others see problems. Miguel adjusted his worn saddle, leather creaking. But it was after Miss Margaret. That's when he really threw himself into the ranch, like he was trying to work himself to death. They dismounted to examine a section where recent rains had washed out some posts. As Miguel showed her how to test for rot in the cedar posts, he continued talking, seeming to sense Eleanor's need to understand the man she'd married. I've worked for the Hartley family 23 years, since Mr. Thomas was a boy. Watched him grow from a serious child to a serious man. Miguel's weathered face creased in thought. Miss Margaret. She brought out something lighter in him. They'd known each other since childhood. Their fathers were partners in a cattle venture. He loved her very much, Eleanor said. Not quite a question. See, but... Miguel hesitated, then seemed to decide she deserved honesty. It was a comfortable love, like a warm coat you've worn for years. Expected. When she took sick with cholera, Mr. Thomas rode like the devil himself for that medicine. Storm washed out 3 bridges. He swam his horse across Bitter Creek in full flood. Eleanor shivered, imagining the desperation that would drive a man to such risks. When he came back, she'd been dead 2 days. Her parents had already put her in the ground, afraid of the sickness spreading. Miguel's voice grew soft. Mr. Thomas stood at that grave for 6 hours in the rain. When he finally came inside, something in him had closed off. They remounted and continued along the fence line. Eleanor mulled over Miguel's words, picturing Thomas as a younger man, wild with grief and guilt. He blamed himself, she said. Said if he'd left earlier, ridden faster, taken a different route. Miguel shook his head. But cholera, it takes who it wants, sometimes in hours. The doctor said later there was nothing could have saved her, medicine or no medicine. Does Thomas know that knowing and believing are different things? Senora. They reached a high ridge overlooking the ranch. The main house looked small from here, a white jewel set in an emerald valley. Eleanor could see why Thomas had built there. It was positioned perfectly to catch both sunrise and sunset, with natural protection from winter winds. He's different with you, Miguel said suddenly. Eleanor turned in surprise. Different how? He talks more, sleeps less. Yesterday, I heard him humming while working on the accounts. Miguel's smile was warm. I haven't heard him hum since before Miss Margaret took sick. They started back toward the ranch, taking a different route through a small canyon. The walls rose around them, red stone layered like pages in a book, each line marking a different age of the world. Mrs. Ochoa says he's been writing in that journal less too, Miguel added. Used to fill 3 pages a night, now maybe half a page. You all watch him carefully, Eleanor observed. We care about him, Senora. He's a good man who pays fair wages and treats everyone with respect. But more than that, Miguel searched for words. He saved most of us, one way or another. Mrs. Ochoa's husband died in a mine collapse, left her with nothing. I came here after losing my own ranch to drought. Half the hands have similar stories. Mr. Thomas doesn't just hire people, he gives them new starts. Like he did with me. No, Senora, you're different. You're not his charity, you're his chance. And they emerged from the canyon to find Thomas's horse tied near the creek, but no sign of the man himself. Then Eleanor spotted him, kneeling in the shade of a mesquite tree, writing in his leather journal. I'll head back, Miguel said diplomatically. You know the way from here. Eleanor dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Thomas looked up as her shadow fell across his page, and she saw him quickly close the journal. I'm sorry, she started, but Thomas shook his head. No, would you like to see? He offered the journal with an uncertain expression. It's only fair, I suppose. You admitted to reading some before. Eleanor sat beside him on the grass and opened to the page he'd been writing. His careful script filled the paper. May 15th. She wore the blue calico today, the one I said would suit the morning room. When she smiles, her whole face transforms. I find myself creating reasons to make her smile. This is dangerous territory. I gave her freedom to leave. But every day she stays, I become more selfish, wanting her to remain, not as my rescued bride, but as Eleanor, who makes me remember what it feels like to hope. Eleanor's throat tightened. She turned back a few pages, reading entries from the previous weeks. April 28th. E. suggested relocating the chicken coops closer to the garden. Brilliant and practical. Why did I never think of that? May 2nd. Found E. teaching Mrs. Ochoa's grandchildren their letters in the kitchen. She used to teach Sunday school. She says, the children adore her already. The house feels alive when she laughs. May 10th. E. asked about Margaret today. I managed to speak of her without the usual weight crushing my chest. Perhaps grief becomes bearable when shared with someone who understands loss. Eleanor closed the journal gently, handing it back. You write beautifully. It started as a way to document ranch business. After Margaret, it became something else. A place to put thoughts that had nowhere else to go. And now, Thomas looked at her directly, those gray eyes full of something she was almost ready to name. Now I find myself writing about the future instead of the past, about possibilities instead of regrets. Eleanor reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. Tell me about those possibilities. Thomas turned her hand over, tracing the calluses that had formed from 3 weeks of ranch work. I imagine teaching you to break horses. You have the patience for it. I imagine winter evenings by the fire, discussing books and plans for spring planting. I imagine... He paused, color rising in his cheeks. I imagine not sleeping in my study anymore. The last admission hung between them, charged with meaning. I found something else, Eleanor said quietly. In the library, when I was looking for those agricultural texts, your father's diary. Thomas stiffened, but Eleanor continued. He wrote about you as a boy, how serious you were, how responsible. He worried you'd never learn to play, to be carefree. Father was a good man, but he didn't understand. Someone had to be responsible. Mother died when I was 7. Someone had to... Thomas. Eleanor moved closer, cupping his face with her free hand. You've been taking care of everyone else since you were 7 years old. The ranch hands, the widows in town, me. When do you let someone take care of you? His composure finally cracked, and Eleanor saw the lost boy he'd been, the grieving man he'd become, all the years of carrying others' burdens alone. I don't know how, he admitted, his voice raw. Then I'll teach you, the way you're teaching me about cattle and water rights. She smiled softly. We'll trade lessons. Thomas laughed, a rusty sound, but genuine. You drive a hard bargain, Mrs. Hartley. I learned from watching the best. Mr. Hartley. They sat by the creek as the afternoon wore on, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas told her about his plans to expand the ranch northward, about new breeding stock from Scotland he was considering. Eleanor shared her ideas for a vegetable garden that could supply not just the ranch but some of the struggling families in town. As the sun began its descent toward the hills, Thomas stood and offered Eleanor his hand. Ride back with me. They mounted their horses and rode side by side, not hurrying, letting the horses pick their way through the familiar paths. The setting sun painted everything gold: the grass, the distant mountains, Thomas's profile as he pointed out a hawk circling overhead. Eleanor, he said as they neared the ranch house, that first night, when I gave you those papers, I need you to know something. She waited, watching him gather his thoughts. I said you were free to leave any time. That's still true. It will always be true. He reined in his horse, turning to face her fully. But I need you to know that if you leave, you won't be the only one who goes. The man I'm becoming again. The one who remembers how to hope he only exists because you're here. Eleanor felt tears threaten. Thomas, I'm not trying to bind you with guilt. You deserve to know. You deserve the truth. She nudged her mare closer until their knees touched. The truth is, Thomas Hartley, I made my choice. I'm exactly where I want to be. As if to seal the promise. She leaned across the space between them and kissed him soft and brief, but real. Their first true kiss. There in the golden light, with the ranch spread before them like a promise of all the years to come. When they drew apart, Thomas's eyes held wonder. "Eleanor, I know," she said softly. "Me too." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. But everything had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained had dissolved like morning mist. When Thomas helped her dismount at the house, his hands lingered at her waist, and Eleanor didn't step away. "After dinner," Thomas said quietly, "would you sit with me in the study, not to work on accounts, just to be there?" "Yes," Eleanor answered, and watched his face transform with a smile that made him look years younger. As she went inside to freshen up before dinner, Eleanor paused at the window to watch Thomas lead the horses to the barn. Miguel appeared to help, and she saw the older man clasp Thomas's shoulder, obviously pleased by something he saw in his employer's expression. The house that had felt so imposing that first night now felt like home, and the man she'd married to escape one fate had become the fate she'd choose again and again, given the chance. Tomorrow, she would ride to the hilltop and look out over their land, not his land or her land, but theirs. She would make her final, irrevocable choice to stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because there was nowhere else she'd rather be. Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room, watching the dust cloud approach from the direction of town. She recognized the rickety wagon before she could make out the driver, her father's distinctive slouch unmistakable even at a distance. Her stomach clenched, but not with the fear she might have felt 2 months ago. Now, with Thomas's ring on her finger and legal documents bearing her name locked in his study safe, she felt only a tired disappointment that this confrontation had finally come. Mrs. Ochoa appeared at her elbow, following her gaze. "Should I send Miguel for Mr. Thomas?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "This is my business to handle." But even as she spoke, she heard Thomas's boots on the porch. His uncanny ability to sense trouble bringing him home from the eastern pastures earlier than expected. He entered the morning room still dusty from riding, his expression darkening as he too spotted the approaching wagon. "Your father?" "Yes." Thomas moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his solid presence without quite touching. "You don't have to see him." "I know." Eleanor smoothed her hands over her apron, a practical calico, not the silk Thomas had offered to buy her. "But I want to. I have things to say." Her father pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house, climbing down with the aggressive movements of a man working himself up to something. He looked older than when she'd last seen him, his face red with drink and sun, his clothes bearing the shabby appearance of a man whose wife no longer tended them. "Eleanor," he called, not bothering with the courtesy of the front door. "Get out here, girl. We need to talk." Thomas stepped forward, but Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. "Let me." She walked onto the porch with deliberate calm, Thomas a step behind her. Her father's eyes flicked between them, calculating. "Mr. Shane," Thomas said coolly, "I don't recall inviting you onto my property." "I'm here to see my daughter," Shane shot back, though his bravado faltered slightly under Thomas's stare. "Got business with her?" "What business could you possibly have?" Eleanor asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Her father's face twisted into an ugly smile. "Well now, seems I might have been hasty in our original arrangement. Man came by yesterday, willing to pay twice what Hartley here paid. Figured we might revisit the terms." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt Thomas go rigid beside her, but she kept her eyes on her father. "I see," she said quietly. "And what makes you think you have any say in my life anymore?" "I'm your father?" Shane blustered. "You do what I tell you, girl. Always have." "No." The word came out clear and sharp. "I'm not your daughter to sell anymore. Mr. Shane, I'm not your property to trade for your gambling debts. Now, you listen here. No. You listen. Eleanor descended the porch steps, facing him directly. You sold me, like a horse or a piece of furniture. You didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye when you told me. Shane's face reddened further. I did what I had to do. We were going to lose everything. You'd already lost everything that mattered, Eleanor said. You lost it at card tables and dice games. Mother's garden is dead. Emma and James go to bed hungry more nights than not. And your solution was to sell your eldest daughter to the highest bidder. Hartley got a bargain, Shane said, trying to regain his bluster. Pretty girl like you, good for breeding, knows how to keep house. The sound of Thomas stepping forward made Shane stop mid-sentence. But Eleanor raised her hand, keeping her husband back. Yes, he got a bargain. Eleanor agreed, her voice carrying across the yard where she knew ranch hands were listening. But not the way you think. Thomas Hartley paid your debt and gave me freedom. These clothes I'm wearing, I bought them myself, with my own money from my own bank account. This land we're standing on, 10,000 acres of it are in my name alone. She pulled a folded document from her apron pocket. This is a deed to 50 acres of good farmland north of town. There's a small house, a well, and enough cleared land for planting. It's yours if you want it. Shane's eyes went wide with greed as he reached for the paper, but Eleanor pulled it back. There are conditions. Emma and James come to live here, where they can attend school and have proper meals. Mother can choose stay with you or come here. You take this land and you work it. No gambling, no drinking away the profits. Miguel will check on you monthly, and if you've kept to the agreement for 1 year, the deed transfers to your name. You can't. You don't have the right. I have every right. Eleanor interrupted. I'm offering you what you never offered me, a choice. Take the land and the conditions, or leave now and never come back. Shane's face cycled through various shades of red and purple. This is about that money, isn't it? The other fellow. He's offering. There is no other offer that matters, Thomas said, his voice cutting like a blade. Your daughter is my wife. Any man who thinks otherwise will deal with me directly. But the money, Mr. Shane, Eleanor said quietly. Do you know why Thomas calls this place Widowmaker Ranch? Her father shook his head, suddenly wary. Because he bought it from a widow whose husband died trying to break a horse while drunk. The man thought he knew better than everyone, thought he could handle what he couldn't. She stepped closer. You're trying to break something that isn't yours to break anymore. Walk away now. Take my offer. Or continue down this path and find out why even the toughest men in the county fear my husband. It was a bluff. Thomas had never hurt anyone, but her father didn't know that. He looked between them, calculating odds like the gambler he was. The house got a stove? He finally asked. Yes. And a root cellar. And glass windows. And my young ones, they'd live here. They'd be educated, fed, and loved. Emma's already shown aptitude for numbers. She could learn bookkeeping. James wants to know about horses. Miguel would teach him. Shane's shoulders sagged, the fight going out of him. For a moment, Eleanor saw the man he might have been before the gambling, before the drink, before pride ate away at whatever good was once in him. Your mother misses you, he said quietly. Then she's welcome here. Always. Shane took the deed with shaking hands, not meeting her eyes. You've gotten hard. Eleanor. No, she said. I've gotten strong. There's a difference. Her father turned to go, then stopped. That other man, the one who came asking, he said Hartley hadn't, that the marriage wasn't real, said you were still what? Eleanor's voice could have frozen fire. Still pure, still sellable, still yours to auction off? She moved closer, and her father actually stepped back. Let me be very clear, Mr. Shane, I am Thomas Hartley's wife in every way that matters. I chose him. He chose me. And any man who suggests otherwise will learn how thoroughly this marriage has been consummated. It was a lie she and Thomas still kept separate rooms, but the implication landed as intended. Shane's face went pale, then red again. "I'll send the children tomorrow," he muttered, climbing back onto his wagon. "Mr. Shane," Thomas called out. The older man turned reluctantly. "If you change your mind about the land, if you go back to your old ways, if you ever try to use Eleanor or her siblings against her again." Thomas let the threat hang unfinished. Shane nodded quickly and drove away, the wagon kicking up dust that hung in the still air long after he'd disappeared. Eleanor stood watching until she felt Thomas's hand on her shoulder. "That was magnificent," he said softly. She turned to face him, suddenly exhausted. "Was it I just bought my siblings from my father? What kind of person does that make me? The kind who protects those who can't protect themselves." Thomas cupped her face gently. "The kind who turns a devil's bargain into salvation for 2 children. The kind who offers redemption even to those who don't deserve it. He might not take the land, might not stick to the conditions. Then Emma and James stay here regardless. We'll make it legal if we have to." Thomas's thumb stroked her cheek. "You gave him a chance. That's more than he gave you." Eleanor leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence. Around them, she could hear the ranch returning to normal cowboys heading back to work, Mrs. Ochoa preparing lunch, the everyday sounds of the life they'd built together. "You called me your wife," she said. "Not your rescued bride or your purchased arrangement. Your wife. Aren't you?" Thomas asked, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "Eleanor, these past 2 months—" "I know," she interrupted, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. "I know, Thomas." When they drew apart, she saw Miguel standing by the barn, a wide grin on his weathered face. Mrs. Ochoa watched from the kitchen window, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. The ranch hands tried to look busy while obviously observing. "You realize the entire ranch just witnessed that," Thomas murmured, his arms still around her. "Good," Eleanor said firmly. "Let them spread the word. Eleanor Hartley kisses her husband in broad daylight. Let that gossip make its way to town." Thomas laughed, a full, rich sound she'd only recently begun to hear. "You magnificent woman." "You're magnificent woman," she corrected, then blushed at her own boldness. "Yes," Thomas agreed, his eyes warm with something that looked very much like love. "Mine, and I'm yours, completely, thoroughly, legally, and—" He kissed her again, deeper this time, uncaring of their audience, passionately. When they finally went inside, walking hand in hand, Eleanor felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She'd confronted her past, claimed her power, and chosen her future. Tomorrow, Emma and James would arrive, bringing new chaos and joy to the big house. Her mother might follow, finally free to choose her own path. But tonight, Eleanor thought as she caught Thomas looking at her with barely contained longing, tonight might be when they finally stopped pretending this marriage was just an arrangement. Tonight, she might finally walk past the master bedroom door with Thomas beside her, neither of them looking back. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like coming home not to a place, but to a person who'd given her freedom and stayed to see what she'd do with it. She squeezed Thomas's hand, and when he looked down at her, she smiled with all the promise in her heart. "Tonight," she said softly, and watched his eyes darken with understanding. "Tonight," he agreed, and the word sounded like a vow. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Shane had become Eleanor Hartley, and the ranch bustled with preparations for the spring gathering. Chinese lanterns hung from every available surface, their bright paper catching the morning breeze. Tables groaned under the weight of food: smoked beef, cornbread, beans flavored with chilies, and pies of every description. The entire county had been invited, and from the wagons already arriving, most had accepted. Eleanor stood on the porch, checking her list one final time. Emma, now 13 and blossoming under proper care, helped Mrs. Ochoa arrange wildflowers in mason jars. James, at 15, worked with Miguel and the hands, setting up the wooden platform where musicians would play. Their mother, Sarah Shane, who'd chosen to leave her husband 3 months ago, directed the placement of quilts under shade trees for the elderly guests. "You've outdone yourself, mija," Mrs. Ochoa said, pausing beside Eleanor. "This gathering will be remembered for years." Eleanor smiled, though her stomach fluttered with nerves. Thomas wanted to make a statement. "I just hope it's the right one." The statement, she knew, had nothing to do with food or decorations. Thomas planned to announce something that would shake the very foundations of Texas property law, at least in their corner of it. "Eleanor," Emma called out, "the Hendersons are here." And so it began. Families arrived in steady streams, cowboys and ranchers, farmers and townspeople, even Mr. Chen with his family. Despite the look some gave him, Eleanor greeted each one, playing hostess with a grace that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Mrs. Garrett arrived with the banker's contingent, her expression sour despite the festive atmosphere. "My, such extravagance," she murmured, eyeing the decorations. "One wonders at the expense." "One shouldn't wonder too hard," Eleanor replied pleasantly. "It might strain something." Sarah Shane covered a laugh with her handkerchief, and Mrs. Garrett moved on, defeated. By noon, over 200 people filled the ranch grounds. Children ran between tables, their laughter mixing with fiddle music. Old men gathered under oak trees, discussing cattle prices and the possibility of rain. Women admired the gardens Eleanor had planted, now blooming with spring flowers and vegetables. Thomas appeared at Eleanor's elbow, handsome in his Sunday suit. "Ready, as I'll ever be." He climbed onto the wooden platform, raising his hand for silence. The crowd gradually quieted, turning expectant faces toward him. "Friends, neighbors," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly, "thank you for joining us today. As you know, this ranch has been in my family for 30 years. My father built it from nothing, and I've tried to honor his legacy." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the Hartley story's success through hard work and fair dealing. 6 months ago, Thomas continued, I gained something more valuable than land or cattle. I gained a partner. He extended his hand to Eleanor, who climbed the steps to join him. My wife has brought new ideas, new energy, and new purpose to this ranch. The irrigation system that's doubled our eastern pasture yield her design. The cooperative agreement with the Hendersons for water rights. Her negotiation. The school fund that's already sent 3 local children to college. Her initiative. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as the crowd murmured with surprise. Women didn't typically receive public credit for business achievements. But more than that, Thomas said, his voice growing stronger. She's shown me that true strength comes from sharing power, not hoarding it. Which is why, before all of you as witnesses, I'm announcing that Eleanor Hartley is now co-owner of the entire Widowmaker Ranch, all 60,000 acres, all assets, all decisions, equal partners in law and in fact. The silence that followed was deafening. In 1880s Texas, married women rarely owned property. For a husband to voluntarily grant such power was almost unheard of. Judge Morrison stepped forward, papers in hand. I have the documents here, properly filed with the county. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley is indeed full co-owner, with all rights and responsibilities therein. That's not legal, someone shouted from the back, one of Shane's old gambling cronies. Women can and do, Judge Morrison interrupted firmly. The law is clear. Property voluntarily transferred between spouses is perfectly legitimate. I've filed it myself. Mrs. Garrett looked ready to faint. Several ranchers appeared stunned, but then Sarah Shane started clapping, slowly and deliberately. Emma joined her, then James, then Miguel and Mrs. Ochoa. Soon, half the crowd was applauding while the other half buzzed with shocked conversation. Furthermore, Thomas said, raising his voice over the noise, we're establishing the Hartley Foundation, to be managed jointly by Eleanor and myself. It will provide education funds, widow relief, and emergency assistance to any family in the county that needs it, because prosperity means nothing if we don't lift others as we rise. This announcement met with more enthusiasm, particularly from the farming families who'd struggled through recent droughts. Eleanor stepped forward, finding her voice. We're also announcing a partnership program. Any family interested in farming portions of our unused land can apply. We'll provide seed, tools, and expertise in exchange for a share of the harvest. No one should go hungry when we have fertile land sitting idle. You're giving away your patrimony. Mr. Garrett, the banker, protested. This is madness. This is community, Thomas corrected. My father built this ranch on the principle that strong neighbors make strong fences. Eleanor has shown me that strong partnerships make even stronger foundations. The crowd's mood shifted as people began to understand the implications. This wasn't charity, it was opportunity. Families who'd been struggling could now have a chance at stability. One more thing, Eleanor said, her voice carrying new confidence. The old Henderson place, which we purchased last month, will be converted into a school, a real school, with a trained teacher from San Antonio, free to all children in the county regardless of circumstances. She looked directly at Mr. Chen, who stood with his children at the edge of the crowd. All children. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the county had seen. Music filled the air as couples danced on the wooden platform. Children raced between tables, stealing cookies and laughing. Even Mrs. Garrett, after 2 glasses of punch, was seen smiling as she discussed the school plans with Sarah Shane. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Judge Morrison approached Thomas and Eleanor where they stood watching the festivities. That was quite a shock you gave them, he said, eyes twinkling. I haven't seen the county establishment so shaken since the railroad bypassed us. Change is rarely comfortable, Thomas replied, his arm around Eleanor's waist. No, but it's necessary. The judge studied them both. You know, when I married you two, I wondered what would come of it, a marriage born of such unusual circumstances. The best things often are, Eleanor said softly. Judge Morrison smiled. I wonder if you'd consider doing me one more favor. Of course, Thomas said. Would you consider renewing your vows properly this time, in front of all these people, so there's no doubt about the legitimacy of your union? The judge's expression grew serious. There have been whispers, suggestions that the marriage isn't complete. This would silence them definitively. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances. In the months since that night when Eleanor had chosen to stay in the master bedroom, their marriage had become real in every sense, but the town didn't know that, still whispered about the bought bride and her arrangement. Yes, Eleanor said firmly. Let's do it now. Word spread quickly through the gathering. The platform was cleared, lanterns lit as darkness approached. The entire crowd gathered, forming a circle around Thomas and Eleanor as they stood before Judge Morrison once again. Dearly beloved, the judge began, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly, we gather here to witness the renewal and affirmation of vows between Thomas and Eleanor Hartley. 6 months ago, they entered into marriage. Tonight, they choose each other again, freely and gladly. Eleanor wore the red silk Thomas had bought her that day in town, its color brilliant in the lantern light. Thomas had removed his jacket, standing in shirt sleeves and vest, looking younger and happier than anyone had ever seen him. Thomas, Judge Morrison said, do you take Eleanor as your wife, your partner, your equal in all things? I do. Thomas said clearly, today, tomorrow, and every day after. Eleanor, do you take Thomas as your husband, your partner, your equal in all things? I do, Eleanor replied, her voice strong. By choice, by desire, and by love. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you still and always husband and wife. The judge grinned. Thomas, kiss your bride properly this time. Thomas didn't hesitate. He swept Eleanor into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, passionately, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind about the nature of their relationship. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. As they drew apart, breathless and laughing, Eleanor saw her siblings beaming, her mother crying happy tears, Miguel and Mrs. Ochoa embracing. Even Mrs. Garrett was dabbing at her eyes. "Look," Thomas murmured, pointing to the horizon. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and a full moon rose over the eastern hills, bathing the ranch in silver light. The Chinese lanterns swayed gently, their warm glow creating pools of golden light where children played and couples danced. "You gave me freedom," Eleanor said softly, for Thomas's ears alone. "You gave me life," he replied, pulling her close again. They stood together on the platform, watching their community celebrate below. The ranch that had once been Thomas's fortress of solitude had become a beacon of hope and possibility. The woman who'd been sold to settle a debt had become a force for change in the county. Later, much later, after the last wagon had rolled away and the lanterns had been extinguished, Thomas and Eleanor walked hand in hand to the hilltop where she'd made her decision to stay all those months ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Choosing this life?" Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd become everything she'd never dared dream of: husband, partner, best friend, lover. "Never," she said. "You gave me the freedom to choose, and I choose you. Every day, I choose you." They stood on the hilltop, looking out over their land, not his or hers, but theirs, and Eleanor knew that the best was yet to come. They would build that school, establish that foundation, raise children of their own alongside Emma and James. They would weather droughts and floods, prosperity and hardship, always together. The moon climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang. Eleanor leaned into Thomas's warmth, feeling the solid earth beneath her feet and the vast sky above, and knew herself to be exactly where she belonged. The girl who'd been sold was gone. In her place stood Eleanor Hartley, landowner, pioneer, and partner ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. "Let's go home," Thomas said softly. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, taking his hand. "Let's go home." They walked down the hill together, toward the limestone house that glowed white in the moonlight, toward the future they would build together, toward a love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning into something stronger than either had imagined possible. Behind them, the moon continued its journey across the Texas sky, a silent witness to the transformation of a devil's bargain into a love story for the ages. You know, friend, as I sit here telling you Eleanor and Thomas's story, I can't help but think about the bridges we build in life, not the wooden kind that span creeks, but the invisible ones between hearts. Thomas gave Eleanor freedom when he could have claimed ownership. And in that giving, he received something far greater: a partner who chose to stay. That's the thing about gratitude, it transforms obligation into choice. Eleanor's father saw family as property to trade, but Thomas understood that family is built on respect, not possession. When you give someone wings, sometimes they choose to nest beside you. I've watched plenty of marriages in my time, seen how force breeds resentment while freedom nurtures love. The Hartley Ranch became more than land and cattle. It became a place where broken people found wholeness, where a purchased bride became a powerful woman, where a lonely man discovered that sharing control meant gaining everything. Every time I pass that white limestone house, now filled with the laughter of grandchildren, I remember the greatest gift we can give those we love isn't chains that bind, but trust that liberates. That's how you build a family that lasts one choice at a time.